Hello, welcome everyone to Woolf Public Seminar, the Post-Kantian Philosophy series. This is the fourth session in the series in question. Our previous speakers have included Robert Stern, Aaron Simmons, and Matthew Clemente. And I should just note that those previous talks are available on the Woolf YouTube site, and today's talk will be recorded and posted there as well. Seminar meets once a month, typically on the last Thursday of the month. Today is a little bit different in that we're meeting on the first of the month. I should note that next month, January, will again be slightly different in that rather than having only one speaker, we're due to have two. So we have talks from Adrian Moore at Oxford and Emmanuel Falk in Paris, both of whom will be giving papers on Kant. If you're new to the seminar and this is your first time, let me just say a little bit about the mechanics of how this all works. We're going to have a presentation from today's speaker that will run roughly 45 minutes to an hour, followed by an open discussion period. In the interest of time, just because I think today we're going to have a rather large gathering, I'd ask if you would just keep your question relatively brief. I'll be moderating the discussion, and I'm going to do my best to permit follow-up questions when I think they're necessary and would be useful. Today's speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce, is Lee Braver, professor of philosophy from the University of South Florida. Professor Braver's main interests are in continental philosophy, especially Heidegger and Foucault, Wittgenstein, realism, and the dialogue between continental and analytic philosophy. He's the author of A Thing of This World, A History of Continental Anti-Realism, Heidegger's later writings, A Reader's Guide, Groundless Grounds, A Study of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, Heidegger, Thinking of Being, and editor of Division 3 of Being and Time, Heidegger's Unanswered Question of Being, as well as a number of articles and book chapters. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lee. The title of this talk, by the way, is Heidegger's Eternal Rereading of the Same Nietzsche, the Eternal Return as Polysemic Hermeneutics.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me. Thank everyone for attending. I worked really hard on that title to make it as bad and as obscure as possible, and I'm pretty proud of the work. I'm going to keep working on it, but I think I can do better. This is a paper that is a presentation that comes from a paper I'm writing with Will Parkhurst, who is here in the audience, that comes from a book that I'm working on, which itself came from a paper, which came from a book. So it has a long and strange provenance, which I think is kind of appropriate for the topic. And we're talking about Heidegger, his thinking about thinking, which is what he does throughout his career, what I think most great thinkers do. And one of the main conclusions that he reaches from the beginning to the end of his career is that thinking is historical. He holds this quite dear, and he is one of the main disagreements he ends up with Husserl. But because he's thinking about thinking, there's a reflexivity built in here. And we're going to see a reflexivity come back and over again. It's going to return over and over again throughout this presentation, because since he's thinking about thinking, whatever conclusions he reaches are going to feed back into the method or the approach he uses to get to them. Yeah, there we go. So because he's thinking about because he thinks that thinking is historical, all thinking is historical, doesn't create its own context, it engages with the tradition. Well, that's got to be true of that thinking as well. So we think about the tradition, we learn how to think about the tradition, we come to realize that thinking is thinking through the tradition by thinking through the tradition, which of course, Aristotle said we learn by doing. So when he reads other philosophers, which he does quite a bit of, one of the things that he's looking for is ways to think about how to read philosophers, how to think about the past, how to deal with the tradition, how to engage with it. And one of his main interlocutors here, of course, is Nietzsche. Joan Stombaugh said that he wrote more pages on Nietzsche than everyone else combined. I haven't done the math, but it's quite a few pages on him. And there are a number of reasons why he holds a privileged place, but he's very important to Heidegger as one of the thinkers that he wants to engage with, and therefore he's going to be looking at him, among other things, for this topic, for the historicality of thinking, for how to read one's predecessors. And in his Nietzsche lectures, he is interested in 4 theses, which he sees as kind of interdependent, and he focuses mainly on the Nachlass, the unpublished stuff. But in what is called thinking from the early 50s, which is what I'm mainly going to be focusing on, the second quarter of it focuses on Nietzsche. And I always used to kind of skim through it. I never found it very interesting until this last time I taught it, when I thought it was, scales fell from my eyes, and I found it an amazing reading of Nietzsche. And there he focuses very much on Thus Spoke Zarathustra and its primary idea of eternal return. And of course, Nietzsche himself said, this is my greatest book. You can see, if you got the handout, number 3, he does not shy away from praising his own work. He thinks Zarathustra is rather good. And Heidegger thinks this is, his one thought, this is same thought, and this is what we need to work on. And so, again, this is what he's going to look to in this book, what is called Thinking, about the nature of thinking, about the historicality of thinking. He's thinking historically in order to think the historicality of thinking. And the second quarter of it is about Zarathustra and eternal return. So what is eternal return? In its most basic form, it means that the same events that have happened in the past will occur exactly the same over and over again forever. They have occurred over and over again in the past. And your personal past, your personal history, what has happened to you, will occur over and over again forever. But that's just the bare bones. The significance of it, the meaning of it, varies from place to place where it appears in Nietzsche. In the Nachlass, it seems to be, it appears to be a very straightforward cosmological claim. This is how the universe works. Here are my arguments for, given the nature of matter and time and space, this is the way the universe functions. In Gay Science 341, it's put as a hypothetical thought experiment. It starts off as what if. And what we're supposed to take from it, of course, is itself varied. It's supposed to be, the question is, what is your attitude towards it? That's supposed to be a litmus test for whether you're well disposed to your life, whether you're an Ubermensch, or you could take it as a criterion for how to make decisions. He packs a whole lot into just a couple of paragraphs. But in Zarathustra, it's different from all of those. In Zarathustra, and if you're following along on the handout, we're at number 4. In Zarathustra, it has to do, the context it rises in has to do with 2 difficulties concerning the past. The first is that the past can be what he calls a painful embarrassment. So Zarathustra is all about this very, very loose sense evolution, about growing, expanding, moving on past our present state, from humanity to Ubermensch. But of course, if we are growing significantly, then our prior state, by comparison, will be inferior and embarrassing and something we don't really like thinking about. And when we think about the past, one of the most common things that we do is we have regrets. Oh, if only I hadn't done this. I wish I hadn't showed up at that party in that outfit. I wish I hadn't said this thing to this person. And so we frequently think about the past in terms of what we wish hadn't happened. And the second issue is, and here's a quote from the chapter on redemption, which is the chapter that Heidegger focuses on in what is called Thinking, one of the primary places where Nietzsche discusses eternal return. He talks about not just a negative event in the past, but the very nature of the past itself, the nature of time in terms of its passing. Because if we are fundamentally will to power, if we want to exert our will, well, the past is done, it's gone, it's over, it's set in stone, and we cannot change it. So he says in this quote at 4b, that we are powerless against what has been done. We're an angry spectator of all that has passed. We can only look at it instead of doing anything, and that's what makes us angry. The will cannot will backwards, because time does not will backwards. That which was is named the stone he cannot move. So in this sense, really, regardless of what happened, how good or bad it is, the very fact that we have no control over it is vexing to a being that wants control. And the fact that these are the events that really led up to what we are, that made us who we are, feeds into all kinds of issues about autonomy and being ourselves, because these things are just never going to be our choice. They're never going to be in our control. They're what he calls these dreadful accidents. They just happened to us, and yet they made us what we are. So the solution that eternal return is both a problem and a solution. It has, again, many meanings. As a solution, it solves both of these problems. It solves the second one, 4b, because if time is a circle, then willing forwards is willing backwards. Then the past isn't gone forever. It will return. It will come back. And if it comes back, then we can will it. The will can will backwards by willing forwards. Backwards and forwards now lose their traditional sense as mutually exclusive, utterly incompatible, and enter into a very new, weird relationship. And this is what I'm calling proto-deconstruction. I think the word deconstruction is thrown around way too much, but here it's awfully like what Derrida does. These are two ideas that seem like they cannot be brought together, but he brings them together in a way that they cannot be taken apart anymore. You cannot have forward that isn't backwards. You cannot have backwards that isn't forward. The past is the future, but only as the past. The future is the past because it has happened. The past is the future because it will happen. But the past is the future as still the past, because it has to be the same that happens over and over again. So the idea of eternal return has this weird kind of solvent dissolving force on ideas that takes away or makes it hard to maintain them in their standard sense, especially in their standard sense of oppositions, which is, where is this? Oh, yes, number 6, this faith in opposite values. And Nietzsche says this faith in opposite values is what kind of is one of the prejudices of philosophers, is one of the fundamental faiths of metaphysicians. I think they're opposite, but he wants to think, well, maybe they are insidiously related and tied to each other. But it's such a difficult thought to think that we can't even think it today. We have to wait for a new species of philosopher to come along. It requires a transformation of thinking to think this interdependence of oppositions. And yet this is what eternal return requires of us. And this is what eternal return induces in us. This is what eternal return starts us towards thinking. These ideas as mutually interdependent instead of mutually exclusive. And so by doing this to the past and the future, we now can will backwards. We now can exert our will on the past by affirming it, by saying, yes, I do affirm, I want this to happen again. I say yes to it all. I am now exerting my will on the past. And it solves the first one, the painful embarrassment, because I'm accepting everything. It's the eternal return of the same. Everything is exactly the same. And so I'm willing it, but I can't be willing it selectively. I can't be editing it and saying, well, I'm going to accept this because I really enjoyed that day, but I'm going to reject that because that was an awful day. I have to accept the entirety of it. And that overcomes the resistance of the past to the will, and it overcomes the resistance of the pain and the embarrassment to our preferences. Now, eternal return also, it deconstructs a whole bunch of things. It's really just the most remarkable idea. I mean, Nietzsche has some pretty outrageous things to say about it, but my God, it is amazing. Again, not just in itself, but what it does to other ideas. And it deconstructs the ideas along with time and other things of will and change. And if you're looking for central ideas in Nietzsche, will and change are pretty good ones. Because what you do is in the solution to it is that you say, I'm not going to change anything. My immediate reaction is I want to change stuff. I want to leave some stuff in my past out. I want to keep some stuff in. I want to change it in order when I relive it. But the way to solve it is I'm not going to change anything. I will the whole thing. I affirm the whole thing, and I'm refraining from changing anything. But what's extraordinary here is that by refraining from changing anything, you change everything. You change the significance of it. You leave all the details there. You leave all the facts, the events, the people, but you change what they mean. You change what you do is a revaluation of their value, because they began with the value of painful embarrassment, of I wish that hadn't happened. And now they have the value of, yes, I'm glad this happened. This led up to me. This is part of my past. This is part of who I am. I celebrate this. It began as a dreadful accident and becomes thus I willed it. And the word he uses is that the will recreates it. It doesn't create it, but it recreates it. It turns the it was, this just happened, to I willed it. I'm recreating it now as something that I am choosing. And that's a radical change. That changes the valence, the meaning, the significance of it, the value of it, the interpretation of it. And for Nietzsche, the interpretation of something, the meaning of it, the value of it, these are not superficial features of what a thing is. These go all the way down. Things are what we interpret them to be. There isn't the thing in itself, or the fact in itself, or the meaning in itself, and then what we interpret it as. That's the Kantian picture that he's rejecting. There are only things as we interpret them. So if we interpret the past differently, it is different. Which means that by not changing it, we are changing it. But it's crucial that we aren't changing it. The only way that we can change it is by not changing it. It's not that we can have change and not change at the same time and kind of squeak by the principle of non-contradiction when it's looking the other way. It's that the only way that we change it is by not changing it. If you try changing it, then you're not accepting the whole thing, and it no longer has changed its value to you. It still is burdensome. It still are things that you wish you could avoid. It's only if you accept the entirety of it and don't change anything that the whole thing changes. It's only if I do not apply my will to any individual thing that I can apply my will to every single thing. So these concepts, he's forging this new concept of time, of will, of change that operates on different rules than what we're used to, than what metaphysics does, what logic does. And that's why we need a new species of philosopher to think it. And that's why Zarathustra was calling for the Ubermensch, who was the only one who could accept this. So the past returns as the same, but as different. You see, it's both. It's not the same instead of different. It's different because it's the same. And it's the same because it's different. And those aren't just, trying to sound cool. That works. That's the only way that it works. unfortunately, I only have an hour, so I can't go into it. This fits a whole bunch of Nietzsche's ideas: perspectivalism, of his celebration of creativity, of his view of interpretation, of his rejection of things themselves. Just a whole bunch. It all fits into this view. Okay, so that's part one. Now we're on to part two. Nietzsche kind of famously says in number 8, the first quote, that every great philosopher is a personal confession of its author and an unconscious memoir. And he's constantly blurring the line between himself and Zarathustra. And the plot of the book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, is about the character Zarathustra trying desperately to come to grips with eternal return, trying to accept it. And in some of his letters, Nietzsche says, I'm having trouble, I'm trying to accept this. So he's really talking about himself here. He's applying this to himself. It really wouldn't be very important or interesting if he came up with this idea and then didn't think it was worth living by or applying it to his own life. And he went through this phase of thinking about his past very, very explicitly. In 1886, he wrote prefaces to a whole bunch of his books. He came up with new editions, and he appended these new prefaces where he reflected on his books. And then 2 years later, he wrote Ecce Homo, his autobiography, where again he wrote about these. And it's an autobiography, but there's not a lot of bio in it. He doesn't talk a whole lot about his life. It's really an autobibliography. It's about his life as books. He's just constantly talking about his writing, and that seems to be how he understands his life. So the person that he's reflecting on, the life that he's reflecting on, is Nietzsche the thinker, Nietzsche the writer, Nietzsche the philosopher, and that's whom eternal return will be applied to as a philosopher, which of course is what Heidegger is interested in. So what would be the painful embarrassment for Nietzsche, the writer? What would be the thing that Nietzsche, the philosopher, the author, would be like, oh God, I wish that hadn't happened. I wish I could just blot that out from my past. I wish I had never done that. Well, certainly one of them, if not the main one, would be his early obsequious devotion to Wagner and Schopenhauer. Number one, he really lays it on thick. He really just says they're just amazing. And number two, he came later to really not just disagree with them, but despise everything they stood for. He came to find them the opposite of what he thinks, that he's dedicates himself to fighting everything that they stand for. And it's especially embarrassing because he published it. It's public. Everyone can see it. Right? He can't just hide it. And so if you look at number 8, the third quote is from the preface to this much later preface to Birth of Tragedy, which is a Schopenhauerian reading of Wagner, his first book. And he says, I repeat, I find it an impossible book today. I declare that it's badly written, clumsy, embarrassing. Again, this was a couple of years after he finished Zarathustra. I shall not suppress entirely just how unpleasant it now seems to me, how alien it seems. So he can't even recognize it as himself. It's so different that it doesn't seem like him anymore. It's 16 years ago. It's about people that he now despises, or at least their thoughts, and it's embarrassing. But what's interesting is that he doesn't suppress these works. He doesn't try to buy up all the copies and burn them. He doesn't disown them. He doesn't say, look, they're just not me. They're my juvenilia. Ignore them, please. Avert your eyes from my early, acne-filled youth. He republishes them. He sends them out again. He takes ownership of them. He appropriates them, but he sends them out with new prefaces. And then 2 years later, with his autobiography, where he has sections on each one of these books. And the prefaces and the autobiography say, here are these books, here's how to read them. He doesn't suppress them, he doesn't edit them. I mean, you can imagine like a jilted lover after a breakup goes and cuts the faces of their lover out of all the pictures of their vacation. You know, he could cut Wagner and Schopenhauer's name out of everything. He doesn't do that. He leaves all the words the same. He leaves the text the same. But he tells us to read it differently. He tells us to think about it with a different significance. He is mastering it by reinterpreting it. And if he had to change it, that would be a weakness. That would mean he wasn't well reconciled with his past. That would mean he couldn't overcome it with just his interpretation. To leave it the same and to change it is far more powerful, far stronger than actually changing the words. And he says in 10, my 10, these are all in the handout, the will to power interprets, in fact, interpretation is itself a means of becoming master of something. And his interpretation of these works, the thing that he says about them over and over and over again is the same thing. What he says is, I wasn't really talking about Wagner and Schopenhauer there. It looks like it. Yeah, of course it looks like it. They're in the title of 2 of the essays of Untimely Meditations. But I wasn't really doing that. Read these essays as if I was talking about me. When I was writing about Wagner, when you see the name Wagner, put Zarathustra. When you see the name Schopenhauer, put the name Nietzsche. And then it'll say something completely different. The same words will carry totally different meaning. And then if you read it that way, the later Nietzsche, the Nietzsche of 86 and 88, I can affirm this. Why? Because it's literally self-affirming. He's saying now the only thing that the younger Nietzsche, who wrote Birth of Tragedy and Untimely Meditation, the only thing he was actually writing about was himself. And therefore, it was a complete self-affirmation. And so when the older Nietzsche now affirms these earlier books, he is affirming his self-affirmation as a self-affirmation, or self-affirmation of self-affirmation, the self-affirmation squared. It is no longer about anyone else. It is no longer about his being influenced by something external to him. It is about himself. So what he's doing here when he re-releases these books is he is in this literal sense reauthorizing them, because he is on the one hand giving a stamp of approval, reauthorizing, yes, these are mine, I take ownership of them, I appropriate them, I assimilate them, they are mine, they are me, no matter how alien they seem to me, they are me, they are my past, I'm becoming who I am by taking my past over. But on the other hand, he is reauthorizing him, because now the later Nietzsche is the author of this. He is the author of the younger Nietzsche as the author of these books. He is creating a new author who is creating these books. He is rewriting them without changing the wording. So he is republishing these, is letting them return as the same. But he's affirming them. And through this affirmation and through this reinterpretation, he is altering them. So the texts come back as the same and as different. The texts come back as changed and as unchanged. The texts come back from the future because they have new things to say. They're saying something that they didn't say before. They weren't written in stone, the stone that the will cannot move because it's the past. We think of writing as in the past. It's done. There's nothing we can do about it. That's the way that the last man thinks about the past. That's why he gnashes his teeth against the past. I can't will backwards. But we can. We can will backwards by rereading these works. The texts are malleable. The text can say new things, which means we can will backwards because these books are always in our future. They're always coming to us from our future. And that's the temporality of eternal return. The past is in our future. And one of the most extraordinary things that's going on here is that what the older Nietzsche is saying, the Nietzsche of the prefaces and Ecce Homo, is he's saying, look, the way that I read then in my youth was a really good way to read, because what I did was, when I read, I just projected myself into what I read. It looks like I was talking about someone else, but really I was talking about things that were my interest, that was my concern. I made these texts address what I want to talk about. Now, the later Nietzsche is saying that's what the younger Nietzsche did. The older Nietzsche, because he's talking about writing, he's talking about reading, he's talking about texts, there's a reflexivity here because he's writing these works, he's writing these prefaces, he's writing the autobiography, which means that what he's saying about the writing about the early Nietzsche has to have some application to what he's writing now, what the older Nietzsche is saying. And so what he's tacitly saying as an unwitting, as a tacit confession or memoir, is that I, the later, older Nietzsche, am doing what I'm ascribing to the early, younger Nietzsche. I'm projecting my interest now in 86 and 88 into my younger self, 70 and 74. It's just that what my interests now are in the later work are this way of reading, of projecting yourself into texts. That's what I'm really interested in now that I'm writing an autobiography. When I'm writing my autobiography, when I'm writing my prefaces, what I'm interested in is how to reread in a way that I can assimilate. I can take ownership of it. I can make my past my own. I can repeat it as the same, but as mine. And the later Nietzsche is making the young Nietzsche talk about those concerns by making the early Nietzsche read in that way. So the older Nietzsche is assimilating the younger Nietzsche to his present way of reading by making the younger Nietzsche a guy who assimilates what he's reading, Wagner and Schopenhauer, into himself in this kind of nesting dolls of hermeneutics, this bizarre, fascinating structure. Now, as we've said, because of the way that eternal return works, looking backwards is looking forwards. These cannot be separated. What Nietzsche's doing in the prefaces and Ecce Homo is looking backwards at his early works to impose an interpretation on them. This is how to read these. He is trying to control their meaning. Read them this way. I don't want them to, I want you to read them as I am telling you now. Looking forward from the past into the future, what we have is a mirror image of that. We have the same, but different. We have the same, but reversed. Because what he's saying in 86 and 88, when he's doing this rereading of himself, is he's saying, look, my text is malleable. I can reinterpret it. I can make it say what I want. How do I know that? Because what I'm making it say is that I can make it say other things. That when I was writing back then about Schopenhauer and Wagner, I was really writing about Nietzsche. So he's showing in 88 and 86 how the 70, 74 was malleable by showing how it made Schopenhauer and Wagner malleable in this domino effect. But the domino effect doesn't stop here, because there's going to be a domino here. He has to know it's reflexive. Just as I now am reading my earlier self, someone's going to read me. Just as I am the future of my past self, I'm the past of a future reader. And as that past, I can be oppressive. I can be a stone that hangs around the neck of a future reader who will gnash their teeth and want to change it. And by rereading himself in this way, by making his text plastic, malleable, rereadable, he is giving tacit consent to future readers to do the same to him. By controlling backwards, he's letting go of all control forwards. It's the same gesture with opposite meanings. The same, but different. Which, again, obeys this exact same logic that he's forging for the philosophers of the future in Beyond Good and Evil 2. And what's incredible is that, and this is in number 11, over and over and over again, Zarathustra says, don't listen to me. Don't take my truths. These are my truths. I'm a teacher, but if all you do is learn, then you're paying a teacher badly. And Nietzsche says the exact same thing. And we find all these parallels between what Nietzsche and Zarathustra say. And they're both saying, don't follow me. Don't listen to me. So in the text, he's saying, read the text how you want. Over and over and over again in all kinds of different ways. Because that's what he does to himself by making himself do that to Wagner and Schopenhauer. And that's the ultimate lesson that he's teaching. Okay, that's part 2. Part 3. Now, we, as the farther future of Nietzsche, we have his future in our past. We can see what happened to him, and we can see the future, the reader in his future, what he did. In the future, the next great reader of Nietzsche was Heidegger. And what does Heidegger say? Heidegger says the same thing about texts. If you look at 12a, this is one of, I think, his wittier comments. He says there is no such thing as a Kant in itself, right? There's no such thing as a text in itself, a meaning in itself, very much like what I quoted number 7 above from Nietzsche. He says, I don't want to just replicate what a book says. I'm not trying to bring it, the past into the present as the same in the traditional sense of the same. No. I have a new understanding of the same. I, Heidegger, have a theory, a notion of the same, which is a big topic in the 50s and in what is called thinking, that combines sameness and difference, just like eternal return does. And all of these texts are the same text that says something different to every reader, to every period. The texts keep returning as the same, but as different. And any notion of the reading, the interpretation, the correct one, as Nietzsche said, is the last man who sacrifices the future for the present, who ends creativity, who is a fetter or a chain on our will so that we only become an angry spectator of the past. But with this other sense of the same, right? We don't want to just preserve the same as the identical, nor do we want to just make stuff up. So what other thing do we have? We have this idea of this new idea of the same, but it's the same and different, where the same words can say different things over and over and over again. It's polysemy. Because there is no text beyond it. And what does Heidegger do when he reads these philosophers? He's notorious for turning every philosopher he reads into a Heidegger, which is exactly what Nietzsche says he did to Wagner and Schopenhauer. Heidegger makes every philosopher talk about the question of being. Why? Because that's what he's interested in. He's not blowing them off and making stuff up. That would be utterly different. But neither is he just trying to have a telepathic, a seance where he brings the person back, because it's impossible. And also, who cares? He's reading this because it's of interest. It provokes us. It tells us something new. It comes from the future, not the past. It tells us something about what we're interested in. So of course he's going to read these about what he's interested in. He's having a dialogue with them where they're alive and they can say new things. I also think it's an unfair caricature to say he turns them into, but that's a whole different paper. And what does he see when he looks at the history of philosophy? Well, he sees every philosopher says the same thing. He says this over and over again. All philosophers say the same thing. Which means the history of philosophy, the thing that he's trying to think, is a continual reoccurrence of the same. That's what it is. It's the same happening over and over again in different ways. And these are all the quotes on number 13. It's the same. What is it? It's being's revelation to us. It's how being manifests itself to us. It is the manifestation of being, but it manifests itself to it differently in every epoch. It is the same and it is different. And every philosopher is saying something different because they're saying the same. They're saying how being manifests itself to it, that's the same, but how it manifests itself to them is different. And this sameness that they're all saying also has the self-referentiality, the reflexivity, because they're all saying the same. That means the thing that they're talking about is common, it's shared. They're all discussing the same topic. But why? Because that topic is sameness. The thing every single philosopher is discussing is sameness. Because what they're all talking about is how being manifests itself to our thinking. That's what they're saying. What else could you say? Except this is how being things look to me. This is how I think things are. That's what every one of them is talking about. And that is going back to the beginning, going back to Parmenides. Being and thinking are the same. Heidegger says, we've never moved from the start. We haven't taken a step from the very beginning. This idea that being and thinking are the same, not identical. That's a bad notion of same. That doesn't help us. But the notion of same and different, that Nietzsche helps us think, that Heraclitus helps us think. Oh yeah, that's great. Thinking and being are utterly different and are the same, are interdependent. This idea that thinking and being are the same in that sense, this is what echoes through the halls of time. This is what resounds in every epoch. for those who can hear. We're still saying the same thing, but we all have to find our own way of saying it. And so the same is recurring over and over and over again, which, and he says this many times, if you look at this in normal ways, it makes no sense. It's bizarre, it's ridiculous. But if we have the kind of ideas and concepts that Nietzsche forged for the philosophers of the future, then it makes a lot of sense. Then we can think about the history of philosophy in this wonderful, wonderful way that captures both the commonality and the divisions and the differences. So this notion of the sameness, which is the sameness of being and thinking that Parmenides gives, it's also this distinctive notion of sameness has also been rattling around from Heraclitus to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says Heraclitus is the one person who might have anticipated eternal return. Well, yeah, right, because he's got the idea of these mutually interdependent opposing forces, the sameness, exactly the kind of concept that Nietzsche is forging with this. Right? Not just that he talked about conflagration of the whole universe, but he's got in his notion of strife the same notion of sameness. And so Heidegger is using this idea to read and study and think and reappropriate the history of philosophy as his history, as his past. Because this is what being does. Being keeps sending us different things, but the sending is the same. And even in what it sends, although they're different, those are the same, because those are about the sameness of thinking and being. And if you look, there's so many quotes, it's really hard to pick a few. Where is it? Shoot. Oh, here, yeah, the second one on number 13. He says the saying, and this is the translated as this thinking being of the same, becomes the basic theme of all Western European thinking. It's the same. The sameness is the same topic everyone talks about. The history of that thinking is about a sequence of variations of one theme, even when Parmenides is incited. So Kant says something totally different, but it's in the same, not identical, sphere. And then Hegel says he transposes and transmutes, but it's the same thing. And the next quote, this points forward to the later epochs of the history of being. And so and so Heidegger even locates it in Zarathustra, when he's reading it in what is called thinking, that Nietzsche is helping him think this, because the title is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is what Zarathustra said. Well, the very first word Zarathustra said, the first thing he said is, talks to the sun, you great star, what would your happiness be had you not those for whom you shine? Right? And Heidegger comments on this. Those words, which historically reach back to the heart of Plato's metaphysics, because the sun, that's in the Republic, that's one of his main ways of understanding forms, and thus go to the core of Western thought, conceal the key to Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Maybe not the key for Nietzsche, but the key for Heidegger's Nietzsche. Because the sun can't shine without someone there to shine for. Being can't be without thinkers thinking it. The very first thing that Zarathustra says is about the sameness of thinking and being. But it's only there if we can think about it this way, if we have these concepts, we have this way of thinking. And we think this, he thinks this because being keeps sending us the sameness, which is another reflexivity. Because we think this sameness, because being sends this sameness, which at a meta level shows the sameness of thinking and being. It's the sameness of two samenesses. The sameness in thinking, the sameness in being are the same, right? That might have been too much. And then just one final cherry is that Heidegger not only reads others like this, he reads himself this way. His readings of himself are terrible if you think about them in the traditional sense. If you think that what he's doing is, here's what I was thinking at the time, here's the contemporary correct single interpretation. They're not. They're awful. I would give them a very bad grade in a class. But what he's doing is he's returning them in a way that interests what he's doing now. Because why not? He does that to other philosophers. He's doing that to himself. And one of the ways that he got that was from Nietzsche's reading of himself, reading of Wagner and Schopenhauer. He's learning how to engage with the past by engaging with the past, by learning from Nietzsche. And he uses it to understand others and to understand himself, just like Nietzsche did. And I didn't put the quote in there, but Heidegger says over and over again that these words, he says, thinking and poetry are the same. Again, his notion of sameness. And one of the reasons is the polysemy of language. Poems mean so many things, and we're very, very at ease with coming up with our interpretations of poems and not worrying about what the poet thought. And this is Heidegger releasing his works into the future, just like Nietzsche did. This is Heidegger saying, here are my writings, let them provoke you. Right? The words, my intention isn't what matters. What matters is what you can make of it. Which again goes back to the beginning with Heraclitus saying, listen not to me, but to the logos. Don't think about what I'm thinking about, think about what the words say. And I think I'll stop there.
Fantastic. It's now discussion time. So Lee has asked me to be the one to field questions. So if there's a comment or a question that you have to contribute, simply raise your hand, as it were, and I will call on you. I just ask for your patience because I can be a little slow when it comes to things like this, but we'll work through it. So yes, let's see. Anna, it looks like you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much. I would just like to thank Lee Braver for this fantastic conference. It was really fantastic, and just a comment on his last words. Thinking and poetry are the same because of polysemy. I think it comes to mind that this way of thinking, it's very pictorial. It's a thinking like an image. What do you think about it?
Well, I think perhaps he would want to reverse that thinking about images is like thinking about thinking. You know, he always wants to say we need to we need to, you know, do our best. This is what all philosophy says, but I think he does it better. We need to check our preconceptions at the door. Right? So we think we know what thinking is. We think we know what images are. We think we know what poetry is, but let's wait and let's see. So a thinking that, I mean, you know, what a metaphor is, what an image is, what a poem is, what an argument is, all of these are up for grabs. And you know, Derrida has this fantastic passage where he says, you know, people are always accusing me. I'm not arguing. I'm not, you know, giving actual arguments. And he says, every great philosopher gives a totally different kind of argument. Every great philosopher doesn't just give arguments. They change the way we argue. Philosophy just is the constant changing. Where one, you know, people from one century would not even recognize later ones as arguing. So we're all in this kind of listening to the call of being. We're all, you know, listening for what we find persuasive. And that can be, you know, anything. If we are open to it, it can be an image like the House of Being. It can be a citation of a poem, like where the saving power is, there where the danger is, there the saving power grows. Right? I mean, those can be load-bearing parts of an argument. Because who's stopping us? What are the argument police going to crash through the windows and put bags on our heads if we do this wrong? You know, we're the ones who decide what's persuasive and what isn't. So any of these kind of hard, fast divisions are self-imposed. And we can make them porous if we find them to be so. Did that respond well? I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you. I think so. It's an ever emerging a revelation.
Mm-hmm. And it's a response. We're always responding in our thinking and not just kind of building something out of nothing and willfully our decisions.
Fusis crupestae fulae. Nature loves to be self-hiding, as in the translation of Professor Hamming.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I mean, Heraclitus is my patron saint, but especially for this topic. I mean, there's a whole other aspect of this project which really brings him in, and it's so interesting because Nietzsche says he's the person I feel most comfortable with. He's the person who might have anticipated eternal return. And this notion of sameness, I think he gets the word from Parmenides, but again, think it's modeled much more on Heraclitean strife.
Nathan.
Yeah, I have two questions. One about the relationship between amor fati and the eternal return, and the other one being when you were talking, I've never seen this before, but the ecstatic temporality that is in Heidegger, and the relationship between the temporality that you describe in the eternal return, where the past is in the future is in the past, and that's how I read Heidegger's understanding of temporal, the ecstasis. So, yeah, those are my two questions: the relationship between amor fati and eternal return, and the relationship between Heidegger's understanding of temporality and Nietzsche.
Well, so I originally had something about amor fati in there, and I took it out because I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, and I'm timid about putting forth a claim which then people will pile on. But as far as I can tell, the solution to eternal return is amor fati. Okay. I don't see much daylight between them, and again, that might be a lack of sophistication of my grasp of it, but willing the past exactly as it was, that sure seems like amor fati to me. Affirming it, wanting it to recur again, that, you know, the recurring again is different, but it's because you are loving it and you're willing it. I'm sure there are people who know it much better than me who could tell me much more differences, and some would probably say they're very important differences, but based on my limited knowledge, I don't see much. And for the temporality, yeah, absolutely. I don't think, again, from my knowledge, Nietzsche only became an important figure for Heidegger in the mid-30s. But of course, he talks about the three forms of historicality in Being and Time, and those, there's some overlap here. But from the beginning of his career, Heidegger is trying to break down the notion of the traditional notion of temporality, which is a series of now moments that are mutually exclusive, that when one comes along, it pops out the others, and that are just, definitionally, absolutely different. And he wants to mix them. He wants to bring them together. He wants to unite them. And when he sees Eternal Return, I think, I don't recall him saying this anywhere, but it seems to me that he's like, oh, yeah, right. Here's something similar, right? Here's a fellow traveler. I'm not alone in having this weird, very, very untraditional notion of temporality. There is this counter tradition that I can start exploring of other people who had a notion of temporality where the tenses are intertwined. The tenses cannot just be cleanly put into piles that never touch each other. So I'm not saying he was inspired by that, that's where he got the idea, but I definitely think that he recognized it as similar. And let me add, because this is something else I took out because I wanted to get in under an hour. I briefly referred to this in the talk, but it's really amazing. You talked about the temporality of Being and Time, which has some resemblance to this, but the later stuff, specifically about textuality, is much, much, much closer to Eternal Return temporality, because he says over and over and over and over again, these inceptual texts, by which he means the very beginning ones, the pre-Socratics primarily, the things that began the Western civilization, they are not in the past. And they're in my quotes, there are several of them where he says, don't think about this historically. Don't think about this. And by historically, he means historiographically. He means the way history is normally done, which is, first there was year 500 and then year 1000, and they're in order, and as soon as the past is gone, says, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. He says the inception is still incepting. The beginning is still beginning. It is still giving notions, new ideas. It's still saying new things. That's the importance of polysemy, that these words can keep saying new things. And that's why he says over and over and over and over again, they approach us from the future. Now, of course, there's some similarity there with Being and Time, where the past, we approach the past back from the future, but it's much more like Eternal Return, where the past literally is in the future, and we give it this new meaning. It takes on this new meaning. So it's very important, his later work, to talk about how these texts all come to us from the future. And that's putting the past into the future, which is exactly what Eternal Return does.
Nathan, if you have anything that you'd like to say in response, please feel free to go ahead.
No, I love it. I mean, the way that I read, even in Being and Time, I guess it's maybe through reading the later work, but that authenticity, for example, is really the understanding of finitude that comes from death, and then also the appropriation or the choosing of one's history, and not in the past sense, but one is thrown into the world, and through actually choosing it, that is kind of our access to authenticity. So I could hear that in the idea of the Eternal Return, where it is through the full acceptance and the choosing of what is that actually alters what was in that sense, and alters the possibilities for the future as well. So I just see that it's very interesting.
Heidegger quotes the Pindar quote, "Become who you are,"
right?
Which is the subtitle of Ecce Homo. I mean, this idea that we have the thrownness. This is the dreadful accident. This is stuff that just happened to us. But through amor fati, we and through affirming it, we do what Heidegger called handing the tradition down to ourselves. Right? We give it to ourselves. We don't create it out of nothing, but we give it to ourselves. So I think there's a ton of overlap there. And for finitude, finitude to me, one of the, Nietzsche says that ultimately what the impediment to eternal return is this raging against time, against the passing of time. And what Zarathustra does at the end is he says, I embrace my own perishing, right? I am going down now, right? And I'm releasing my teaching. And I take that, and that means a bunch of things, but for one thing, because he is defined as the teacher of eternal return, one of that means is I'm releasing control over what my words mean, right? And that's what finitude, that's the textual version of finitude. I mean, one of the things is, all of these things come out of eternal return. One of them is an alteration in the understanding of subjectivity. Because Nietzsche says it's not I think, it's when it thinks, is when thoughts come to me. So he's taking control of his thoughts out of the subject, out of the ego, out of the self. Well, he's doing the same thing with the author to the text. The meaning comes when it comes. The meaning occurs when the reader reads it. Right? And there are all these different readers. So it's absolutely an embrace of finitude in relation to writing. In this context, which for Nietzsche is just one of the fundamental defining features of who he is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love it. I've never, So it's like there's a memento mori and a amor fati that's kind of nested in there.
And like I said, I think that I used to. It's so weird how the same gesture has opposing value. To impose your will on your own texts is at the same time to release your control over the text to others, because both of them say the text is malleable, the text can be reread different ways. And that's how I now see Heidegger's rereading of his own works. I used to find them laughable and ridiculous, and him just saying, not being able to say I was wrong, not being able to say I'd changed my mind. I'm saying, no, I really thought that back then. And now I see it as his, a real embracing of finitude, because he knows that's what's going to continue happening to the text. And that's why I love this quote that I give in 14. The second one is the very last sentence of Original Work of Art. Is for the author himself, however, there remains the quandary of always having to speak in the language most opportune for each of the various stations on his way, which I take to mean I used some words then, now they're not very helpful to me, so I don't use those anymore. And I'm going to keep changing these words. And I'm not, works not ways. I'm not going to cling to these words. I'm not going to cling to tenets or claims or theories. I'm going to go with the way of thinking, which I think is very much an embrace of finitude and receptivity and responsibility.
Yeah. Beautiful. Where do we get this? You said is this a document that we have access to?
In the chat, there's a link, right?
Oh,
the Google Doc.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Oh,
that's just the outline with a bunch of quotes.
Maybe I came in late. Can someone repost it?
It's still there. It's at it should be at the very top of the chat. Speaking of the chat, we have a question that an attendee posted there, so I'll read it to you, Lee. The question says, may I ask, did younger Nietzsche anticipate that the older Nietzsche will be interested in reinterpreting his younger works, just to close up the circle of eternal return?
Yes, according to older Nietzsche.
Right.
I mean, you know, I don't know that early stuff well enough to give a good argument to that. He does in the essay on history in Untimely Meditations, which is where the essay on Wagner and on Schopenhauer occurs. He talks it early there, and I've got a quote from there about this plastic power, which is this ability to assimilate what you read into yourself, which is very, very much like what he's talking about here. So that sure sounds like he's kind of hinting or winking at the author, at the reader right there, that yeah, it looks like I'm talking about this stuff, but really I'm always talking about myself. But ultimately, what I think we're heading towards, I mean, I think of eternal return as kind of like a Zen koan, where it's a paradox that goes against the grain of our thinking, especially our dichotomies, to get us to get them to release their grip on us, to make them less obvious, self-evident, compelling, to open us up to other ways of thinking. And one of those ways is about authorial intent, because you can't just say, well, okay, don't care what the author thought, you know, and just dispense with that. We can't. We've got, that's just so built into us as part of how we think. But we want to, at the very least, start tempering it, start changing it, start altering it, so that at the very least it starts meaning something different, you know. So I think Nietzsche and Heidegger are kind of trying to get us to stop opening sentences with phrases like Nietzsche and Heidegger are trying to, you know. We want to, we can't fully dispense with these questions, but neither should we organize our reading around them. And we need to understand what they mean in a different way, I think, right? So what the early Nietzsche meant can only be what the early Nietzsche meant as understood by the older Nietzsche, as understood by me. You know, we don't, as he says somewhere, you know, the author belonging necessarily to the fiction is part of the fiction. Or as Nietzsche says, there's no outside of the text. We try to get outside the text by getting to the author, but that's still part of the text. So we can never get to the reality out there. What did younger Nietzsche really think? We can deal with the text. And again, there's that hint, at least in the very beginning of the essay on history. That would be pretty good evidence. But that's all that we're doing. We're listening to the logos. We're dealing with the text. Did that respond?
We'll see if the person who asked the question has a follow-up, they can write it in the chat. We can get to it later, but we have a hand up as well. I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Is it Mukasa or Mukasey? Feel free to ask your question.
It's Mukasa, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question just for comparison. So if Heidegger is concerned with the question of being for other philosophers, I'm having a hard sense of understanding how your reading of Nietzsche's Eternal Return is anything beyond a sort of existential disposition or exercise. In other words, Heidegger is reading other philosophers and reading the history of philosophy, but is Nietzsche just providing a hermeneutic to life? Or what is Nietzsche's stance on other philosophers? Is it that Plato and Hegel, etc., their problem was they, had a sort of ineffective disposition towards the past, or does he have any positive claims or interpretations of their philosophies beyond the idea that they didn't have a thinking of the internal return? So how does Nietzsche read philosophy? We can see how Heidegger reads philosophy as a question of being, but then how does Nietzsche read philosophy, and how does the eternal return under your reading sort of affect how we understand his reading of these different philosophers of the past? Was it just an existential sort of antidote for like individuals and has very little to do with the history of philosophy as Heidegger's thought does?
Well, one way to address that, and this is kind of what Heidegger says. I mean, Heidegger says that Nietzsche, all of the themes of Western philosophy appear in Nietzsche but transmuted, and he closes the circle. So Nietzsche's big comment about the history of philosophy is that they're allergic to time and becoming, and they escape that to this imaginary notion of static being. That's what they're really obsessed with for a whole bunch of reasons. They're weak and uncreative and so on. Whereas he wants to embrace becoming and flux. And the eternal return, as he says at one point, one of Heidegger's absolute favorite quotes of his, is stamping, I'm going to get this wrong, becoming onto being, putting the character of becoming, oh man, I quote it all the time, stamping being with the character becoming. I think that's what it is. That's the highest will to power, the highest exercise of will to power. And the way Heidegger reads that, and it's a pretty interesting read, is that what eternal return does is it makes the passing of time permanent. It makes becoming static. It makes flux constant. Again, all these contradictions, all these paradoxes, they just spill out of it. And so in some ways he is repeating them, and that's what Heidegger's most known for focusing on. And I think it's really unfair because he talks about a lot of other stuff, but he's most known for accusing Nietzsche of only having a theory of being in a very traditional sense. But that certainly is there. We can see eternal return as an appropriation of the attempt to define what is as the constant properties. But the constant properties are to be inconstant, to be in constant change. And so he's taking it, the same thing, and yet inverting it, changing it utterly, so that it has now the opposite value, the opposite significance, the opposite meaning. So it is their project and it isn't. He's taking it and doing what they want, but subverting it through doing what they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Questions from anyone else? He is open. Well, when everyone else is thinking, maybe I'll jump in. I have a number of things I could mention. I actually have 4. I'm just going to list them off, and you feel free to address which of these if you want. We'll see if you find any of this useful. These are just sort of thoughts of mine that occurred as the presentation was unfolding. So first of all, number 1, toward the beginning of your talk, and this is something that recurs throughout, you mentioned that the historicality of thinking. And so if Nietzsche and Heidegger ascribe to this thesis that thinking is historical, I'm wondering if you might explain, if it's possible, what an ahistorical thinking would be. So I understand that in principle, it could just be that if an ahistorical thinking is impossible, it may also just be totally inconceivable. We don't actually really know what that would be. But I'm interested in hearing if you have any thoughts about what an ahistorical thinking would be, and to the extent that we can kind of make sense of what that would look like. I had this question also about what, in your opinion, if anything, hangs on interpreting the doctrine of eternal return cosmologically, as opposed to just merely in the form of an ethical injunction or a existential exhortation to affirm life. If you really think that there's any sort of important difference there that really matters. And then there was this third thing about the issue about the pastness of the past. And so when you were introducing the eternal return, you noted how typically we think of a past event as being necessary or having become necessary because it's happened and it's unalterable. And so the eternal return sort of calls that kind of conception of pastness or necessity into question, partly because, as you say, the past is now open to interpretation. So it's become open through this sort of future that is going to alter in a way what the past will have meant. But I mean, there are philosophers who don't necessarily adopt Nietzsche's notion of eternal return. You still have, I guess you could say, a somewhat kind of linear conception of time. I'm thinking of someone like Claude Romano, and his view of the event is very similar in that he thinks that the past is still always up for negotiation. It's never settled, because what a past event means is always indeterminate. It's always up for grabs in terms of what will happen. And so I wonder if you have some thoughts about what the difference is between thinking of the past as still radically open in terms of the eternal return, and thinking of the past as still open, even if we're still somehow thinking of the past in terms of a kind of linearity. And then my final point was just this issue about the act of willing, or resolving to refrain from disavowing the past, and this act of willing that things will happen again as they have already. What do you think about this objection that people make that somehow there's still maybe some kind of incoherence in that idea? So that, in other words, if it's the case that I've always already have willed to affirm things just as they will be, or I always already will have willed so, then I don't really actually have an open possibility as whether or not I will make this resolution. It's sort of just, as it were, predetermined or something. So there's a kind of paradox involved in that regard. So those are my sort of four big questions. I don't know if you what you want to say about any of it, but I just thought I would mention all of this, because these are the things that I've always thought about myself for a long time, and just having heard others talk about Nietzsche. So, yeah.
Well, for the ahistorical thought, I mean, I think certainly for Heidegger, there is no such thing, but there are people who most of the tradition doesn't realize that. So they think that it's ahistorical. So there's a thinking that thinks it's ahistorical, even though he says many times ahistoricity is itself a historical product. I mean, ahistorical, you know, it's incomprehensible for a finite temporal historical being to actually think about what it would be like. When we have all these philosophers who imagined it, but it's all, you know, weird and silly variations of what we do. So there's only self-aware historical thought and unself-aware historical thought for them. For the cosmological, beats the hell out of me. I've never gotten that. It's just weird and I don't like it. And again, I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, so I don't have to have an opinion about it. So good, I don't. Yeah, for the other views of the past as up for interpretation, for negotiation without eternal return, it's not that eternal return is the only way that gets us here. I mean, it's a weird way to get us there. It's that it's one avenue towards this idea. It's one way to think it. And the very fact that Heidegger can find it in Nietzsche, you know, again, and here we're kind of straddling the line between using ideas we don't want to use, we're trying to get past. Heidegger could be imposing this on Nietzsche. You know, I could be imposing this on Heidegger, imposing it on Nietzsche, imposing it on early Nietzsche, imposing this on Wagner and Schopenhauer. Again, the Russian dolls just keep going. But even if that's true, that shows that we can do it. You know, so even in what is called thinking, in that second quarter, where he's focused on Nietzsche, Heidegger has this throwaway line. He's got so many ideas that he's got, like a sentence here, a sentence there, that he never follows up on, that, you could write a whole dissertation on these. And he says, oh, you know what, another way this could happen is through, I forget the word he uses, repentance. Now, what I think he means there, I think that's an allusion to Kierkegaard, in particular to philosophical fragments. Because Kierkegaard talks about repentance and forgiveness, and in Kierkegaard's also very elusive and not very clear, but the way I read it is, he there talks about repentance as a way to change the past.
Right, yes.
When I repent, I don't wipe away my sin. It's not gone, but it means something completely different. Right? It now is, the rock bottom that led me to Christ, or it's to forgive is not to forget. Right? But it's an utter change in the past, which shows the malleability of the past. So there are lots of different ways to get here. And of course, Derrida is a master of this, and so we don't have to buy it. And I don't think Heidegger believes in the eternal return. It's just that he finds it, according to this reading, a really helpful way to get to some of these more useful concepts. And the third one, yeah, I mean, you hit on my answer at the end there, where you called it a paradox. Okay. Because here's another one that comes out of it. I mean, on the one hand, my actions are totally determined, because I can only do what I've done every time before. I have no freedom. On the other hand, what has determined me is me. That's the definition of autonomy, right? So I am both entirely determined and entirely free. And I'm entirely determined because I'm entirely free, and entirely free because I'm entirely determined. And I think that Heidegger is trying to get past the determined freedom dichotomy. And again, this could be a helpful way. He doesn't take this answer, of course, but just the idea of surpassing this this apparently exhaustive and mutually exclusive division is helpful. It helps get us beyond good and evil, beyond these oppositions. How are those?
Oh no, that's fantastic. I mean, there's so much more we could discuss, but that was certainly very helpful. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Especially the bit about Kierkegaard and the way in which Nietzsche is trying to overcome this traditional opposition between determinism and freedom. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there are lots of different ways to do it. And like I said, I think it's very hard to tell because it's such a brief comment, but I think he is alluding to this, about as different a one as you can get for this deeply Christian religious one. Is, yeah, you could do it that way too.
Well, unless someone has a final question, I think we'll end here. I want to thank you, Lee, so much for today's discussion. The presentation was really wonderful. And thank you for all the attendees for taking the time to be here and for contributing to what I thought was a really thoughtful conversation. So
thank you for having me. Thank you for attending. And my email's on the presentation if anyone wants to follow up.
Right, and as I mentioned at the outset of today's discussion, this has been recorded and it'll be posted at the Woolf YouTube site. So you're always free, feel free to revisit, tell others who may be interested about today's discussion. And again, we'll all be convening, well, some of us anyway, will be convening next month for kind of a tour de force through Kant. So be aware of that. And if you want to join, register. All right, thank you very much. And I guess that's it for today. Thank you.